Good evening, everyone. My name is Brune Biebuyck, and I'm the director of Reed Hall and the Columbia Global Paris Center, as some of you already know, but I have to repeat it every time. This evening, we conclude our two-day symposium on the life, career, and legacy of Meta Vaux Warrick Fuller. Over the past 2 days, we have gained new insights into her personal history, artistic practice, intellectual networks, and enduring influence. We are deeply grateful to our colleagues, friends, and members of Fuller's family for their generous contributions to these conversations and for helping to expand and sustain her legacy. This gathering marks the first in what we hope will become an ongoing series of annual conversations devoted to the American artists and university women who resided or exhibited at this very address in the years leading up to World War I and throughout the interwar period. We have already begun planning for a similar symposium on October 12, 2026, focused on the Provincetown printers, a group of artists who lived at 4 Rue de Chevreuse prior to World War I and later reconnected within the Provincetown art colony between 1915 and 1920. So mark your calendars. Okay. To close our program, we are honored to welcome Tamara J. Walker, historian, writer, and associate professor of Africana Studies at Barnard College. Her talk this evening will draw on her long-standing research into the relationship between race and travel, offering a lens through which to consider movement, identity, and the transnational dimension of Black experience. She will then be joined in conversation by Maboula Soumahoro, whose work similarly engages questions of race, diaspora, and cultural exchange, bringing our symposium to a thoughtful close. Before I leave, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the Terra Foundation for American Art for awarding us a convening grant that made this symposium possible. I am also grateful to the Columbia Global Paris Center and the Institute for Ideas and Imagination for their support. As well, I would like to recognize the many individuals on our teams whose outstanding efforts brought life to this event, or brought this event to life. Thank you all for being here. I now turn the evening over to Tamara Walker, as I mentioned, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Barnard College. Bonne soirée.
I want to start with some thank yous. First to Brune and Marie for the invitation to participate in this symposium, and for the team at Columbia Global Center Paris for making all of the magic this week happen. I also wanted to thank Meta Fuller's family, Dr. West and Mr. Fuller, whose words and presence here remind us that Meta was more than an historical figure and object of our collective fascination. She was also a real person who was deeply loved and, I'm sure, deeply missed. And finally, thanks for all of you coming here today on such a rainy day. So for the time that I have with you all today, before I am joined by Maboula in conversation, I wanted to situate Meta in a broader history. And it's a history that has taken up a lot of space in my brain and in my heart for the last several years, and that is the history of African Americans abroad. In my 2023 book, Beyond the Shores, A History of African Americans Abroad, I had to start the story somewhere. And so I chose to start it in the 1920s. This was for several reasons, some obvious and then some more personal. I wrote the book for a general audience. It was published by Crown, as I mentioned, in 1920. And for that audience, one of the first names that often comes to mind when it comes to African Americans abroad, it's Josephine Baker. She arrived here as part of a wave of Black entertainers in the 1920s who graced stages here in Paris, also in London, also in Berlin, and beyond, so much so that one commenter at the time said, and I quote, "The Negroes are conquering Europe." So I wanted to spotlight in my book some of the lesser known figures from that era, including entertainers like Florence Mills, who also helped me speak to the tragedy that I saw at the heart of the book. Florence was a useful opener into that tragedy because she dies tragically early, but I also wanted in my writing to disrupt the romantic vision that a lot of people had of African Americans traveling abroad beginning in the 1920s, because for so many of the people I talk about in the book, it was not necessarily a choice to leave their country, and they did so because otherwise they wouldn't have had the opportunities to pursue their professions and their passions and gain a sense of humanity. So I wanted to keep those two things in balance, and that's one of many reasons I chose to focus on Florence Mills. There's another reason I chose to start the book in the 1920s, and that's because that's the year both of my grandparents were born, John and Willie Mae Walker. They also spent many years traveling abroad, and that was all due to my grandfather's military service. He came to France during World War II, and then was stationed with my grandmother and some of my older relatives in Austria in the post-war period, and then moved around until their family got too big, and then my grandfather would travel on his own in the years that followed. That chronology helped me weave what was a larger history of African Americans going, staying, sometimes returning home from abroad, with a more intimate story about my own family and their influence on my own travels. And it also allowed for me to tell a story about a century of people on the move, starting in the 1920s and then ending in the 2020s, when people like myself and many of you here made their way to cities like Paris to follow in the footsteps of the people that I have mentioned today and that are in our hearts and minds. And I have to mention, I think Julia Brown is here. I saw her earlier today. To my delight, she's here because I had taken her tour. I'm talking about you now, Julia. Welcome. I was just shouting you out and shouting out Walking the Spirit tours because it's one of the tours that I took as I was researching Beyond the Shores. And I was very aware as I was writing the book that we were all engaging in this act of collective memory and creating new memories, summoning memories, both of people we hadn't known, people we had known, people in our own families whose stories hadn't yet been told, but who were coming to mind over the course of walking Parisian streets. And so that was a really important part of the story I was telling over the arc of the book from the 1920s to roughly the present day. But one of the things that the symposium today makes clear is that there is a much longer history of African Americans traveling abroad, and that history involved more than just entertainers. Paris has always loomed large in that history. We can go back to the 18th century and think about Sally Hemings coming with Thomas Jefferson and his children in the 18th century. We can also think about lesser known figures like David Dorr, who traveled to Paris and other parts of Europe in the 1850s in the company of his enslaver, who was on a grand tour, a precursor to modern study abroad, where elite American whites were traveling around Europe and cultivating a sense of taste in arts and wine and food. And here we have in the figure of David Dorr, someone who I'm increasingly fascinated with, an important companion in that enterprise who was experiencing freedom, albeit in the context of his enslavement. And of course, Meta was here in 1899. And she wasn't alone in those days. We've heard about her family friend and fellow artist, Henry Ossawa Tanner, who had moved here in 1891. He ensconced himself in Parisian art circles and helped to introduce Meta herself to members of those circles. And in 1900, the author, activist, and educator Anna Julia Cooper made her first visit here to attend the 1900 Paris exposition. She'd also returned here 20 years later to complete her PhD at the Sorbonne, in the process becoming, I think, the fourth Black woman to earn a PhD. And of course, there was W.B. Du Bois himself, who had come to town to co-curate the exhibit of American Negroes at the exhibition. Now, you've heard quite a lot about that exhibit today, and I want to talk about it a bit more in detail for three reasons. The first reason is to give you a fuller sense of the purpose of the exhibit and what was included in it. And I take an excerpt from one of Du Bois's writings where he lays out quite clearly what the purpose was. He says, in this exhibit, there are, of course, the usual paraphernalia for catching the eye, photographs, models, industrial work, and pictures, but it does not stop there. Beneath all that is a carefully thought out plan according to which the exhibitors have tried to show A, the history of the American Negro, B, his present condition, C, his education, and D, his future. And so to tell that story in this small exhibition space, W.E.B. Du Bois and his collaborators amassed a collection of over 500 photographs that featured images of African American families, civic organizations, singing groups, collectives, and also, and really interestingly, a collection of 50 charts that focused on various aspects of Black life in Atlanta, where he lived and worked at the time, talking about the social, economic, and political accomplishments of African Americans in that setting. And so it was a data-driven exercise as well. There were also, and I'll talk a bit more about this in brief, quite a number of photographs, and other folks have talked about this, of Black women at various life stages and ages, from young girls to adult women to elderly women. So the images also chronicle a life cycle of Black people, Black womanhood, despite the emphasis on him, the Negro, right, as this masculine entity. There's a strong, vivid, feminine dimension to the exhibition as well. And that's the second reason I bring up the exhibit, because it raises something really interesting, to my mind at least. For Meta and the other African Americans who were living in and visiting Paris at the time, the exhibit must have made for a really strange experience. The 1900 exhibition was hugely popular. Some estimates put the attendance figure in the millions, which was remarkable considering that it unfolded between April and November, so not even for the whole year. And what struck me about this image that I pulled from the collection of the Library of Congress is that we can see these crowds, these largely white crowds, eagerly awaiting entry into the halls. All of which made me wonder, what was it like for women like Meta and Anna Julia Cooper to be walking the exhibition, knowing that women like them were part of it, to be both the observers and the observed? I started thinking about this, especially when I realized that there were over 100 and possibly even 150 images of Black women in the exhibition, so they take up a lot of real estate. And it made me wonder whether attendees started to gaze in the faces of these real-life women in flesh and blood to see if they recognized them from the photos, or compared the women standing before them with the women that they saw in the photos. And I just kept returning to Meta as I was examining these images. As an artist, she was an observer to her core. So what was it like to be on the receiving end of other people's observations in such a concentrated, intense way, all while trying to mind her own business and focus on Rodin's sculptures, as we heard about earlier today? And I want us to linger on the moment when, or try to imagine the moment when she's walking through Rodin's sculptures, learning from these sculptures, thinking about her own work and her own craft, all while grappling with the mounting and probably distracting realization that she had somehow become part of the exhibit herself. It struck me as an interesting through line connecting generations of African Americans traveling abroad, because they were never traveling alone. There were always images and ideas that accompanied them, whether they liked it or not, whether they knew it or not. And jumping ahead to the present, for contemporary African American travelers, this remains true. And in our case, might include pop cultural depictions of African Americans that sit in people's minds alongside our flesh and blood selves. So to conclude, I want to turn to the third and final reason I bring up the 1900 exhibit. As I mentioned earlier, it was tremendously popular, And more importantly, it was tremendously effective. It largely did as Du Bois intended, which was to increase audiences' understandings, audiences here understanding, and their estimation of African Americans. And we can even argue that it helped to create the conditions of acceptance that made Paris such a popular destination for African Americans in the 20th century in the first place. In other words, the year 1900 made the 1920s possible. But of course, there are important caveats. We've already heard some of them earlier today from Kelly Christina, who reminded us that France was hardly a racial paradise. And this was especially true for Afro-French people with origins in the Caribbean and African continent who were engaged in multi-layered struggles unfolding well before African Americans' arrival and against the backdrop of African Americans' experiences. Struggles for French citizenship, political inclusion, and an end to imperialism, and struggles against the specific forms of exclusion and oppression that shape their everyday lives. All of which raises important questions about how much of the acceptance of African Americans in Paris was at the expense of many of these Black Parisians. After all, African Americans weren't asking anything of France other than for it to not treat them like they were in the US. Which is why I'm so pleased to be in conversation with Maboula today to talk more about the broader and the more complex landscape of Black people, Black life, and Black experiences in Paris that Meta and generations of African Americans were and remain part of. Thank you.
Bonsoir, good evening, everyone. You choose your language to reply. It can be. Bonsoir, Tamara. Thank you so much for this presentation, and I'm also looking forward to this conversation around the African American presence, but in association with the other Black populations to be found on hexagonal soil, right? And that sometimes, in my view, appear as having left out of the conversation. So can we begin by perhaps expanding something that you mentioned in your presentation, that is to say, the romantic vision of France from a certain type of African American, experience or memory or imagination. Do you want to tell us more about this romantic vision that you seem to be intent on debunking?
I mean, I think it's interesting because Paris conjures up an idea of romance for so many people, right? And I think that's always kind of been on the 10, so to speak, right? That's just part of what Paris is. And so I can't entirely blame the people that I wrote about so lovingly in my book, right, for having this romantic vision of Paris. And it was an escape for obvious reasons, right? It was a place where, even setting aside how they were treated, they were able to pursue their art. They were able to find opportunities on the stage, in Josephine Baker's case, on the screen, and to focus on the work that was so meaningful to them, right? And then to experience, I think, the absence of certain things that defined their experiences in the US when they were traveling for theater productions and traveling all over the country to pursue their art, where they wouldn't be able to eat at the very restaurant that they were performing at, right? To give the example of the Cotton Club in New York City, right? That there was always that tension for African Americans that you could do those things, but then there were other locked doors that, I'm not an artist, but I imagine that also has an impact on your art. And so I think the absence of those sorts of things really propelled a lot of writing. And one thing I didn't mention in my talk, but that I talk about a lot in the book, is that the Black press was a really active player in this kind of storytelling. The Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Cleveland Column Post, all of these publications were on the case. Wherever there was a Black person in the world, there was a reporter from the Black press telling their story with such pride and excitement and enthusiasm, and that kind of ushered in an era of travel journalism as well, because they were like, well, let's go see them on stage, let's go talk about their shows and their art, but while we're at it, let's check out some museums, let's check out some countryside tours, right? In a way that they also couldn't necessarily experience in the US. And so that's just a really interesting dimension, right? That the Black press was really actively telling a story about these entertainers, these scholars, these artists, and telling a story for their audiences, right? That you could come see them on stage, you could actually get a seat at the restaurant and be served at the restaurant, and while you're at it, you could also have a really lovely travel experience yourself. And so there were good reasons that people were talking up Paris. The other thing that kind of disrupts the romantic vision is something that shaped Meta's story herself, right? That she tries to come here and is turned away by her fellow Americans because she was Black. And that was often the case for African Americans coming to Paris or traveling to other parts of the world, that they were encountering Jim Crow because there were so many white Americans who thought that Jim Crow traveled with them, like a piece of luggage, right? And so they wanted to impose those same ideas and expectations on this place that didn't belong to them, but somehow nonetheless shaped the experiences of African Americans. So even African Americans knew that it wasn't romantic. And I think there were also many African Americans who understood that they were part of a diasporic landscape, right? And that they were part of a whole, and that their part didn't represent all of it, right? But to your point, and I think this is something that we can get into, that's often missing from the storytelling, right? It's as though in that telling, the first Black people to come to Paris were African Americans, when that was obviously not the case, and there was a complicated landscape of exclusion and struggles for inclusion. And as we learned on our tour the other day with Paris Noir, possibilities for coalition building and community and friendship that often get left out of those stories as well.
And so to continue on this issue of not the romanticization part, but the fact that African Americans did come to Europe and Paris, France in particular, and they did accomplish more or had more freedom. They did enjoy perhaps more success, more liberty, right? But you also mentioned during your presentation the other aspect to this story, that it was not beyond the accomplishments, accolades, successes. It was also a story about having to leave your home, and that it was not that easy or enjoyable.
Yeah, and it's something that I really attend to in the book, in part by talking about these other places, because I think for a modern reader, they're like, well, why wouldn't you come to Paris? Like, what would be the dilemma? Like, get on that boat and get yourself to Paris. But Paris wasn't the only place, and that's also the story I tell in the book, that there were these other sites outside of Europe. I follow some agronomists, for example, that go to Uzbekistan for agricultural project. And this was an opportunity for them. Many of them had graduated from Tuskegee and had worked really hard to come up with solutions that would have been of benefit to the United States during the Great Depression in terms of figuring out the kinds of crops that would help people eat and not die of starvation. And yet they were working as Pullman porters and dishwashers and not being allowed to use their expertise. And so when this group received the invitation to make their way to the Soviet Union, on one hand, it was an opportunity to finally put their minds to work and their skills to work, and they were promised ample vacation time and big houses and servants, an opportunity for some upward mobility. But the thing I try to linger on, and that I hope folks will linger on with me, is that it meant leaving their people behind, right? They would go as part of these collectives, and like our work communities are valuable communities, but we also belong to other communities, right? We have families, we have friends, and we have things that are familiar to us that make us who we are, and that was the dilemma that was present. And there were plenty of people who didn't want to leave. And that, just parenthetically, is something that a lot of contemporary travelers grapple with too, where it's like, well, I don't want to leave my siblings behind, and besides, what am I signing up for? More racism, Better the racism I know than the one that I don't know, especially for places where there weren't many stories coming out about what was possible. And so I wanted to grapple with that, and I think it's worth doing that even for Paris. That it's an easy place for us to get to in 2026 with the miracle of jet travel. And it's an easy place for people to imagine returning to, or in a pinch, if something happens back home, getting back without too much drama. But it was more complicated, right? These were long journeys, and so much of the interesting history about African Americans abroad is the journey itself, right? And we got a glimpse of that earlier today in terms of, or perhaps it was yesterday, the voyage by boat, right? And the changes people felt, but also just the experience of like crossing the ocean. And not for nothing, I'm an historian of slavery by training, so I also think about that crossing.
I was going to say, crossing the Atlantic again.
Again.
Under different circumstances.
Under vastly different circumstances. But also that was likely, at play in people's decision making. So these are complex decisions and individual ones, right? Like we think in terms of collectives. Today's symposium invites us to think about individuals like Meta and other ones whose names we don't know, and what these experiences would have meant for them as individuals.
I do want to continue talking about the 1920s, because this was the beginning of your talk, even though your work is focusing on, going back chronologically, going back historically, and paying attention to the period of time that, as you said, made the 1920s possible. So for the 1920s, before we move back, I have a very selfish question, but now that I already have the mic, it's too late to stop me. I want to pick your brain about Josephine Baker, and you probably already know how I feel. Can we settle the score on this public figure? And even though you touched on it in your presentation, talking about the benefits, or some of the benefits for African Americans to the detriment of, or to the expense of other Black populations that were to be found here on, hexagonal French soil. But maybe you can enlighten me. What don't I get? Or why can't I stand Josephine Baker? I've said it before, I'll say it again. What is this? And how can we
get to a place of understanding, at least?
Yes.
Well, and is it that you struggle with the place that she occupies and the space that she takes up?
Yes.
Because I feel like that's less about her than about the story,
I don't hate
the
her
storytelling, right?
Yes.
But she does take up a lot of space, and that was something I was struggling with when it came to conceptualizing this book. Where I'm like, we have these household names, we know so much about them. People are complicated, and I'll come back to that. But so there's always more to learn about them. And this is where being an historian of slavery shaped my approach, where there are so many people who lived their lives without knowing, and they lived their lives believing that their struggles ultimately didn't matter in the scheme of things, that no one other than the people they knew and who loved them would care about their lows, their highs, their in-betweens, their complexity. And so I've always just been very interested in the people whose names aren't on the board, or who
in the pantheon,
right? Okay, I take your point, right? Right, and why? To your point, right? Why is it Josephine Baker, whose name and whose burial was in the pantheon? To like break that barrier, why is it not a Black French person whose name we know or whose name we don't know, right? And I'd be interested to hear from you.
Yes, and I'm not simply hating, right? Because I'm all about destroying all pantheons, right? So we shouldn't have to be fighting or in rivalry for a place, one single place in the pantheon, because that would automatically create tensions, and that's not the conversation. But this your answer around this question of occupying the space, the instrumentalization, right? It's really not about her, I was.
And at the same time, I mean, she is really complicated, and I'm going to be a bit cheeky. I'm a Housewives fan, and I think what is really interesting about that genre of television is that it introduces us to really complicated women who don't have to be either, all sacrificing
Yeah.
or all
One-dimensional,
right.
like
And
simple.
people can be complicated and messy. And I do think that what would be interesting about taking her up in this landscape that is shaped by that storytelling, and I'm being half cheeky, half serious, because there is an interesting narrative consequence of the Housewives kind of juggernaut that it has produced in Hollywood, more complicated layered depictions of women of a certain age, and as they age and as they evolve in their sense of purpose. So I kind of think it would be interesting to take her up with that lens without putting so much on her, and instead thinking of her as just this richly complex person that is a lot of things, including in the Pantheon.
So now to go back to, the heart of your research, let's go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, the period of time that we've been covering with Meta Vaux Warrick Fuller, and why did you feel the need to go back in time, right? You did mention the 1850s and this gentleman door. You did mention Sally Hemings in the late 18th century. So why this focus on the late 19th century beyond, you're going to talk about the exhibition and Du Bois, and also the, absence and presence, simultaneous absence and presence of the black women artists, including Fuller, that saw themselves represented in photographs, but that were not active participants, right, to this exhibition that was supposed to portray African-American life, right? So why go back to the early 1900s, and how did those years, or this maybe key pivotal period, paved the way for the 1920s, which is the period of time most easily and perhaps most lazily associated with this African-American migration of artists, intellectuals, sports people, and what we know?
I really struggled when I was writing the book, and even sort of talking about the book with chronology, especially because my own training was primarily focused on the 18th and 19th centuries, and I, as someone living in the 20th and 21st century, am obviously attached to what I've lived through and what my immediate ancestors have lived through, but it's less familiar to me in terms of the scholarship and the source base than these earlier periods, and also, again, as an historian of slavery, I was always aware of Black mobility as something that existed firmly alongside the condition of enslavement, and that mobility wasn't always about freedom, right? And I think the story of Black mobility in the 20th century is often attached to freedom and being unencumbered, right? But in the 18th century, in the 19th century, it was deeply tied to enslavement, and also there was room for experiences of mobility. And Annette Gordon-Reed, who wrote The Hemings of Monticello, talks about Sally Hemings' time in Paris in the 18th century, and her brother James Hemings' time, where he was learning the techniques of French cooking that he would then take with him back to Monticello and in turn shape American culinary traditions that we associate with Jefferson, but that were the work of James Hemings. But also Annette Gordon-Reed talks about what it must have been like for a young enslaved girl in 18th century Paris, not only coming from the US, but to be here, right, against the backdrop and in the context of the Haitian Revolution, where all these discourses of freedom are being shaped by enslaved people in the French colonies and here in metropolitan France itself. So they were, for me, it's interesting, and it expands the potential of what we talk about when we talk about Black mobility, and that there's a long tradition of Black people being forced to move, right? Beyond even just like the forced dislocation that is the Middle Passage, but that there were all these kind of crisscrossing experiences, like people going back and forth across the Atlantic, even as enslaved people who were accompanying their enslavers, not just between the US and Europe, but between South America and Europe, between South America and the U.S., between the U.S. and South America, right? That if we looked at that map, there's just a lot of zigzagging that's part of the story of slavery, and also tells us something about what Black people accomplish even with that reality looming over them, even with those conditions imposed upon them. And we see that with some of the ways that Sally Hemings was able to carve out these moments and these relationships. And we see that with David Dorr, who wrote a book called A Colored Man Around the World about his experience on this grand tour in the company of his enslaver. And he spends quite a lot of time by himself. And he has his own desires for this time, to the extent that he can carve out time to attend to his own desires. So that's part of what's interesting to me, that it adds these other layers and dimensions to the experiences that people have in these spaces.
I'm very interested, and this wasn't planned as part of the conversation, in your, interested in your take, your approach of mobility. Mobility would be the main characteristic of any diaspora, right? But you seem to be making a difference between forced mobility, which would define the early stages of this diaspora, and then other forms of mobility that were either free, totally free, or, you know, half and half free, right? And so how do you work with it? Because I think that this is a very interesting, you know, take on the subject, because the diaspora continues, the mobility continues and continues to shape the diaspora itself, but there seems to be those different times and those different modalities of mobility. So what would be your characterization of the mobility in that period of time, right, that we're interested in today for this symposium, for the last 2 days, and that would include the age of Fuller's time in Paris, right?
Yeah, there's, the name of the scholar is escaping me, but they kind of chart out these generations of mobility, beginning with the forced migration of the Middle Passage, and so that takes us to the 15th century, well into the 19th century, and then we have this other period of conditional mobility, for lack of a better description, of people who are having to leave their homelands because of war or because of the lack of economic opportunities. And that's true for so many Black Parisians who were coming here because of the extractive nature of colonialism that made it impossible for them to survive and thrive in the places of their birth. And therefore are coming to France or London or Berlin, and going to the US from the Caribbean, for example. And then there's this more recent generation that gets set in motion, right, in the 1920s, where it's also somewhat constrained and conditioned by what they're having to leave behind, but also it ushers in this era of travel for pleasure, right, that continues to this day. But through it all, you know, there are always exceptions, right, that there are always people who are having to pick up because of conditions beyond their control and circumstances beyond their control. But I think it's interesting to think of it as this sort of generational story that happens in waves, and that we see Meta kind of on the cusp of that, to your point, right, that it's on the heels of some of these forced migrations, like David Dorr is here 30 years before Meta is, and she gets here 30 years after the abolition of slavery, right? So that history is quite fresh. And that's the reason for the exhibition, too, to kind of draw out just how far African Americans had come since abolition. And that's a different moment, right? And World War II also kind of marks, or the First World War also marks a shift in terms of why African Americans end up in Paris, because there is that wave of African American soldiers who had come through Paris during the First World War. And then we have the other experience. And so I think that those contexts are always so important for understanding what was possible and what was meaningful to the people who were having these experiences when they were.
Thank you. To go back to the 1900 exhibition, right? Can we speak a little about perhaps its shortcomings or what you seem to be hinting on when imagining, Meta and others, women artists or intellectuals like Anna Julia Cooper that you mentioned as well, who have attended and seen this representation abroad of this African American experience, history, education, literature. What do you see in terms of representation, and maybe in terms of how this exhibits the photographs that you have mentioned, the statistics that were produced, right? This, I'm not going to say performance because I don't think it was a performance, but this, yes, portrayal of African America, right? As it was received by expatriates, African American, and in the form of women, like we're talking about women here, right? What raises questions? What are the problems? What are the shortcomings of what was presented, and what can still be understood as a feat? This Du Bois and others production, right? Which was an event back in 1900. But what was lacking, missing, silencing, erasing?
Yeah. I should preface by saying I'm not deeply versed in the exposition and the Negro exhibition, but what struck me as I was preparing for today was how academic the approach to it was, right? That it was making an argument and marshaling evidence in support of that argument using charts, right? And distilling a vast array of lived experiences into data points, and like really beautifully rendered data points. Like there's a lot of people who have been paying attention to the charts themselves and just how like graphic they are. They're works of art in and of themselves, and the one I shared is just one of 50. But they're data graphs, right? And so a lot of nuance gets collapsed. And that data is really celebratory, right, on one hand, of the people who managed, despite all odds, right, in the face of Jim Crow, to buy land and property and to improve their financial lot. But there's also the story of the people who couldn't, right? Like they didn't because they could not because they weren't trying hard enough, right? Which can often be the takeaway that uninformed readers could have, right? So it did something really profound. And it was also, it was the work of a scholar who was engaging in
and
a scholarly approach.
Right,
Exactly.
So Du Bois as a sociologist, yes.
And taking a sociological approach that would look different than a historian's approach or an anthropologist's approach or a storyteller's
But
approach.
the problem with Du Bois, is that it was all of those. He was also a historian.
Yeah.
He was also well-versed in the arts. But this production was a work of sociology, right? Yeah, sorry for interrupting.
No, that's an important reminder, right? That this was a multi-talented, well-read, right, polyglot of a person. What better person to mount something like this than Du Bois? But it's also interesting to think about what it means to the flesh and blood people who are standing alongside this academic exercise. So that was kind of where I was interested in imagining what that was like, and getting in the head of Meta and Anna Julia and people who were also here whose names.
So what would be your critical fabulation about this? Meta and Anna Julia meeting up to go see the exhibition in Paris
Oh gosh. Yeah.
one afternoon.
Yeah. Maybe trying to go super early in the morning so they could have it to themselves. And I've been in this situation. One example that comes to mind, I was in Venice, you were there too. Oh yeah, because you and Kayama had this really incredible exchange at the Loophole of Retreat about translation. And to go see
Kayama Glover.
Right, Kayama Glover, formerly of Barnard, now of Yale. And Simone Lee was the American artist in residence at the Biennale.
First African-American woman to head the U.S. Pavilion, and first ceramist also to head the U.S. Pavilion. So it was a big first.
It was a huge first, and it was a weird experience, and I don't know if you felt this way, watching people make their way through the exhibition. And there were so many moments where I wondered if they were engaging it as art or engaging it as a joke. And if you know Simone Lee's work, you know the scale of it and her attention to the Black female form. And this has also happened at like Kara Walker's exhibitions, where people are like posing next to it and like just engaging in it in really gross ways that I'm always super attuned to and sensitive to. Like, how are people taking this in? That disrupts my own experience of the art, where I'm paying more attention to the people paying attention to it than like engaging it myself. So I wonder if that was also their experience, especially Meta as an artist herself, right? Thinking about the photographs as works of art, but also wondering how people are looking at them. I think that's just part of the trippiness of the experience in these sorts of spaces in those moments in time.
In the photograph that you selected, you showed the entrance to the exhibition that was fully crowded, right? So it was a huge success. Is it part of, or is it the beginning of this love affair or love story between France and African America, right? And I think it takes us to what you also mentioned during your presentation that had to do with the imaginary surrounding African Americans that either or that both precedes and accompanies the arrival of African Americans in France and other parts, right? If we could say, you know, about things about this imaginary, how is this African American community perceived from abroad?
Yeah. Well, by way of answering that, the other thing I should mention is that Du Bois himself, again, this is from my admittedly limited understanding, seemed to be very intentional in using the data to draw favorable comparisons between African Americans and other groups, like Germans and the Irish and various groups all over the world, to signal just how much these populations had accomplished in Georgia and other parts of the U.S. To say, well, they've accomplished more, they've done more, they've been capable of more than some of these other populations. So I feel like there was an invitation kind of to compare built into the exhibition. Maybe that's not fair. But the possibility of comparison, I think, is inevitable. And then knowing at the same time that he was engaged in the work of comparison, I think means that there were going to be inevitable comparisons between African Americans, or the African Americans at the heart of that exhibit, and other Black populations, for example, in France, because he was engaging in similar one-to-one comparisons with that data.
And what about this imaginary, right? This favorable imaginary, as you said, preceding or accompanying this, I don't know, influx or this arrival of African Americans. What do you have to say about it? Why is it, or why has it been favorable, particularly in comparison to the other Black populations, right? When you mentioned the expense, the detriment of.
I kind of think that built in to the act of receiving African Americans is the assumption that, for the most part, they're going back home, right? They're going back to the U.S. And I kind of touched on that at the end of my comments, that African Americans weren't making the same kinds of claims, right, to citizenship, to inclusion on a political scale, to African Americans did care about the end of imperialism and did forge these vast networks, right? So I'm not saying they were detached from those political concerns, but from the perspective of the French, maybe that was the read, that they're not making these claims and demands. And these are claims and demands that Black Parisians had every right to make, right? Black French people had every right to make. But it seems that there was less complexity there because the demand was simply that it not be a retread of life in the U.S.
And what would you make of this, if you agree, this paradoxical situation in which the African Americans at the time were unquestionably associated with the U.S. nation at the very time when they were not considered, first-class citizens within the U.S., right? Which makes them, as you said, willing and ready to go back. They're not going to stay permanently. They're not questioning the political situation. They're not questioning or challenging the empire, right? But the fact that their Americanness is accepted, shapes and molds their favorable, welcoming in this other place at the very time, at the beginning. We're talking about the late 19th century. So the beginning of Jim Crow. What do we make of that?
Yeah. One of the most meaningful and moving interviews I encountered when I was researching Beyond the Shores was one that Paul Robeson did with an Australian TV program. It was called ABC, so it was like the Australian Broadcast Corporation. And it was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, against the backdrop of decolonization in Africa. And this Australian journalist is asking him, Paul Robeson, who had been terrorized by his own country and was speaking out against the witch hunts that were plaguing him during, the McCarthy era. And the journalist is like, well, why wouldn't you just move to one of these African countries? And it's on YouTube, and because I'm not going to do justice to it, but it's truly a thing that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Because he's like, that's my country. My grandparents built that country. It belongs to me. And so I think there's that. I think it often gets mistaken for patriotism or blind loyalty, but I think it's something deeper. I think it's about the people who came before us, right? Like so much of what we're talking about is this generational story, and I think that's so much of what moved so many of them, right? The sense of claiming something that belonged to them because of how much work the people who came before them had put into it.
I don't want to be mistaken, but Bob O'Mealy mentioned Invisible Man this morning. Is it one of the characters in Raz the Exhorter in Harlem who has this famous quote who says, their money bleeds black blood, talking about, America, right? So it reminds me of what you just said about this sense of ownership. Like, this is not a country, this is not a land that I'm going to relinquish because I helped build, this country. And the same thing could be applied to this vision of, the African continent as the motherland, the land of origin, and that sometimes can create also another sense, sometimes problematic in my view, but sense of ownership, like this is my land too. So it just reminds me of our discussion around Invisible Man this morning. Yes.
What you're reminding me of is this more recent generation of expats, right, who heeded the invitation of the Ghanaian government, for example, during the year of return to move. And there are echoes, right, of other histories and echoes of colonialism, right, in how so many of these recent arrivals from the U.S. are taking up space and taking up land and enacting or reenacting certain traditions in this place. So
Yeah.
There's always
And
complexity.
do you think it makes a difference that the presidency of Ghana has extended an invitation that also reminds us of the Kwame Nkrumah, first president, first prime minister of newly independent Ghana, that had extended an invitation, right, from the late 1950s on, or even the founding of Liberia, right, with this particular history. So it may appear in the 2020s as a new phenomenon when it actually has an old, if not ancient, history, right?
It's true, which is making me think about the translation you're doing. Or have you completed the translation of Lose Your Mother?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I
yeah.
did finish it at some point.
Yeah, because
yeah.
I'm sure that had
Yes.
resonances.
Yes.
Saidiya Hartman's seminal work, Lose Your Mother.
Yes. Yes, it takes us back to this question, right? Belonging, ownership, territory, land, longing, losing, but always perhaps on the move or trying on the move willingly or unwillingly, and trying to find a home, to find a home, and that will a home that will turn out to be not a hostile environment, right? And that's ongoing, that's a journey, right? Yes. I don't want to go too far and call it groundbreaking, and I don't want to make you feel uneasy, but you know, going back and saying, you know, it's not only about the 1920s. There was a period before, like, so I'm interested in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But when you mentioned somebody such as Anna Julia Cooper, who we know later on, when she completed her dissertation at the Sorbonne here in Paris, was surrounded by a community of black women, right? And black women, not only African American, but also from the, let's say, French Empire. Have you already found in the period that you're now interested in traces or, you know, I don't know, evidence of solidarity between African Americans and other black populations to be found there? Did you find anything there, or is it too early in your research?
It's too early in my research, but Keisha Blaine, who's a scholar of black women's transnationalism at Brown University, has a new book out. The name is escaping me, but it does so much of that work for the 20th century that I would be interested in doing for these earlier periods of thinking about these networks of solidarity, right, that cut across lines of geography and race even, right, that there were solidarities built with Asian women, women from other parts of the world outside of Europe and the US, so it kind of disrupts some of that geography. And that's really interesting to me as an historian of Latin America, right, to think about what had always been there, which is this like north-south set of relationships that are especially visible between African Americans and Afro-Cubans in the late 19th century and well into the present, taking different forms across sports and social and civic life and individual, like religious collectives, and finding these abilities to see one another and to draw inspiration from one another in ways that I have always found really interesting, to draw inspiration from the ways that Afro-Cubans were able to carve out spaces of sociability and political influence that shaped life in the United States. So the work is new, but it is with that in mind, that pursuit of solidarity and community in mind.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you. So I want to push and be a little bit provocative in terms of extending out this conversation a little bit around Paris as both place of possibility as well as a place of erasure, connecting some threads that were sort of mentioned here And I'm thinking particularly about February 1919 and that first Pan-Africanist conference that was organized in Paris, that I think, connecting to what you said earlier, Tamara, sort of opens up this space of Paris as, you know, a space of possibility. But what is often forgotten in that conversation is the fact that Blaise Diagne, who was the first African to be elected to the French Parliament in 1914, but also in 1912, Gratien Condas from Guadeloupe, another man of color, were both in the French Parliament, were instrumental in moving the French state to mobilize resources to organize that conference in Paris. And so I am taking a little bit of a swipe at W.E.B. Du Bois in terms of his role in that conference as secretary, whereas Blaise Diagne was president of this entire thing. And in the way that it's talked about in both the traditional American press and the African American press, the existence of Diagne is minimal at best. Right, and so part of what I want us to think a little bit about is both this possibility and erasure that happens almost simultaneously in this space, and to challenge those of us who do this kind of academic work to think about moving the levers of a state to organize a conference such as this. I don't think Blaise Diagne has gotten his credit, and I'm just putting that out there in terms of just the work that's been done even in French. Much less in terms of this transatlantic conversation about how the levers of state can be moved to mobilize in this way. So I just wanted to throw that into the conversation.
I appreciate that observation, and we got a bit of a window onto the due that he deserves, or the complex legacy surrounding Diagne on our Black Paris tour on our first day, which was, 10 days ago, a week ago, I don't know. But to your other point about kind of how that moment was covered in the Black press, it is interesting to think about the audience for whom the Black press was projecting these stories, right? Not only African Americans, but the white American public, right? And I think that helps us read some of those things. That doesn't discount the acts of erasure, but I think that's an interesting context that is shaping the storytelling and the centering of these players and their influence and the work that they're doing that will not only serve Black Americans, but as they saw it, serve these larger causes. And embedded in that was a lot of paternalism, for sure, right? And self-aggrandizing, right? There's all this complexity bound up in that, but I appreciate that point.
Thank you so much for this exchange and for curating this space. I wrote down my question because I don't want to forget it. But so I'm a sociologist studying contemporary Black diaspora, Black diasporans in France and their integration experiences. And I understand that you both are primarily historians and your work is rooted in history. But I'm really curious about what insights you might have about the extent to which privilege, or maybe relative privilege, sort of influences or shapes upward mobility for Black Americans, for African Americans, both historically and contemporarily. Again, relative to other Black people in France, especially today. The themes that many of the stories of African Americans in Paris that I've read in the 19th and 20th centuries typically describe their maybe misunderstandings or lack of knowledge or maybe even ignorance about the plights or experience of other other Black people, Black diasporans in Paris and in French colonies. But even Du Bois described France as the only real white democracy in one of his unpublished manuscripts. But now I think it's in this era, this age of globalization and shared knowledge, shared history, shared memory, I think it's maybe more like the acknowledgement of privilege, I think is more maybe commonplace, I should say, now than then. And I'm just curious about your insights about, or your thoughts about, like, what does privilege mean in relation to mobility then and now, and what is the role or the what's the word, like, what is our role in making sure that coalition building is possible? And by our, I mean Americans, you know, because there is, as you mentioned in your talk and in your book as well, there is this, you know, this distinction between Americanness and the other, the racial other. And yeah, I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, those are great questions and big questions. One thing that occurred to me during the symposium this afternoon was the sort of class dimension of many of these travelers, and it made me think about there's a new book out by Etheline Whitmire called The Remarkable Life of Reed Pegram, who was in Paris, but mostly in Denmark in the 1930s. And what she chronicles, because she has access to hundreds of the letters that he sent home to his mother, and correspondence with the Rosenwald Foundation, who someone, I'm sorry, it's escaping me, who mentioned the Rosenwald Foundation earlier today. But that was a big source of funding for African Americans traveling abroad. And I think it's important to have that in mind when we think about, like, what made their travels possible, because I think it's easy to imagine, like, well, these were just, you know, upper middle class Black people who had means and weren't really thinking about money and how they would live to feed themselves from one day to the next. A lot of them were cobbling together grants, right, from the Rosenwald Foundation or pools of money that were raised by family members. And with Reed Pegram, he is constantly writing the Rosenwald Foundation for them to extend his grant, to advance him some more money. There's another dimension to that story that I'll leave you to read the book to find out, because he's really zealous in his attempts to stay where he is for really personal reasons. But just the hustle of that, I think, is just so remarkable that, you know, so many of these artists and scholars were there with just small pots of money, right? They weren't just kind of living on inheritances, or they were struggling every day to have money sent from home or to make money while they were here. That's not the only dimension of privilege, right? The economic side. But I think that's an interesting element to factor in, that so many of the preoccupations of these individuals, these early travelers, were fiscal. And there was a desperation there to stay because of what they were enjoying about their time here and what they knew awaited them when they went back home. That adds just an interesting human dimension to it that I think also could, for future research, allow us to think about the points of solidarity that it enabled them to imagine, or the lines of understanding that it opened up. But they always brought that with them. And if you'll allow me, I have a nonprofit that focuses on international travel experiences for low-income high school students. And one of the points that we make to our students in encouraging them to go abroad and to see themselves not as beneficiaries of our largesse because of our scholarship, but instead as people who are deeply resilient and who have cross-cultural competencies that make them valuable when they travel, and important sources of cross-cultural collaboration when it comes to traveling abroad that we don't often value in the US, and that the youth travel machine definitely doesn't value. And so I think there's a lot of ways to answer your questions, but those are some ways that come to mind for me, that there is, both in the past and the present, an interesting amount of nuance there around these questions of privilege.
Before we move on to the next question, because the mic is arriving somewhere, I have a question as I was listening to you. Are the people that we're talking about, the African Americans that we're talking about throughout the ages, were they migrants? It's not a term that I often see associated with them. Like we're talking about the expatriates.
Right.
We're talking about perhaps even the exiles.
Yeah.
But are they migrants?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have an answer right away, but you're raising an important question about who gets to be an expat, right? And who ends up being a migrant, even thinking about the US context, that like we have these categories for people from entire parts of the world who we insist upon as migrants rather than as expats, because there's a certain set of associations we have with expats that they have as well, right? That they're multilingual, that they're cosmopolitan, right? That they are versed in different ways of being and modes of life. Like, who better than so many economic migrants to the US, right? To describe that way. But there's clearly some racialized and class and xenophobic elements to who gets to be an expat versus a migrant, and vice versa. So I don't know yet, but I think that's an important question to probe from a racial and a national perspective.
First of all, thank you for this illuminating conversation. It was wonderful to hear you. And I'm back to Maboula's question, which I thought was such a good one. What's left out when Du Bois is going to put blackness on display? What doesn't he include there? And part of it may be a matter of privilege or class that we don't know. But I'm just trying to think in my mind. He's not, I don't think, letting us know that it's what Rayford Logan calls the nadir. This is the worst moment that we've ever seen. Instead, he seems to be promoting this uplift narrative instead, and showing different, but he's also leaving out a sense of diaspora. He's leaving out what might be called folk culture. There's no ring shout moment there. And I don't want to say more than that, but just that I'm fascinated by that question of what he projects as blackness, as someone who's studied in Berlin and who comes home. His first job is to teach Greek and Latin. That's his sense of the world. He loves the spirituals. I don't know how much he loves the barrel house honky-tonk music that's beginning to bubble up too.
Which is interesting to think about as far as what a reimagined exhibit hall could look like. And this goes back to your question about critical fabulation, like what, with that spectrum of Black American life in mind, what is missing from the exhibition that people would add. I think that would be an interesting project for students to undertake.
Hi, your scope is global, but we're talking about Paris all the time, and it seems to have this preeminent position in this, African American diaspora, especially for artists. But why? I mean, you mentioned, London, Berlin. Why not London, Berlin, Amsterdam, Buenos Aires, for that matter? Why Paris? Why France?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Buenos Aires, because I talk about it in my book, because I became really interested in Richard Wright's time in Argentina, in the Paris of the Americas, and how little he wrote about it, right? Because some of it has to do with just like the scope of coverage in the Black press and in people's own writings. Richard Wright wrote so much about Paris, but hardly anything about his time in Buenos Aires, which I'll have you read the book to get at my sense of why that was the case. But one of the things that I think is useful about starting with Paris is because we know so much about like what that experience entailed, and we have so many vantage points to cover it, it opens up all these questions to ask of other places, like Argentina, like Uzbekistan. went to Germany, I went to Tokyo in terms of the settings for my book, precisely to decenter Paris, right, and to decenter the 1920s, but to also recognize its importance and its galvanizing effect on people, right, that it set in motion a century of exploration, and it's also a place of pilgrimage, right, like that's what it was for a modern day pilgrimage, right, of the people who take Walking the Spirit tours or who take Black Paris tours and who take Noir tours are retracing the steps of the people that they have read about and watched on television, whose books they've read, whose poetry they read, and also their own family members, right? Like that was very much present for me, not just in Paris, but like it is a place that has that apparatus in place because of the long arc of storytelling about it. So it's a center for a reason, but it's also not the whole story. But it's certainly the one that we're talking about here in Paris.
Mm-hmm. And I'm even thinking about Benjo by Claude McKay, that is located in Marseille, and that is a clear decentering of Paris, but there are still mentions of Paris within Benjo, right? This is Marseille, but something, I mean, one of the few other locations that are mentioned include Paris, right? Is Paris a possibility if you want to leave Marseille, and what else can you do in France? So there is this attraction power that Paris as an imperial city too holds in the imaginaries, I believe, in the psyches.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Maboula and Tamara for this conversation. And I particularly want to thank you, Maboula, because you have a way of engaging with Americans, and particularly Black Americans, where you challenge our assumptions, and it gives us food for thought when we leave the conversation. And you know, you're not by yourself. It's you, Rakaya, Mam Fatou Niang, who are engaging in this transatlantic conversation so that we can get rid of this myth of a colorblind France. Because even today, Black Americans come here. I live here. And I say, oh, well, you know, I observe this. And then they do this what up with me, like, well, in America, they do X, Y, and Z. Stay on topic. I'm talking about what happens to Black people here who have built France for centuries, whose countries have been under colonial rule, and whose resources and people have been extracted and continue to be extracted. So I'm like, let's not discount that lived experience. And so you said something that really made me think about the acceptance of Americans. We're not taking up space. And we're particularly not taking up space within politics in the political realm. And politics is power in France. Even if we become naturalized, you don't see Black Americans running for office. And this was most recently, there was just an election, and it was probably the largest ballot of Afro-French elected officials. It caused quite a stir in France, and people were particularly upset about the mayor of Saint-Denis being Black, and it's one of the most...
We have no Black people in France, we're colorblind. They're colorblind. He was just a guy who got elected in Saint-Denis Pierrefitte.
But that's why they refer to him as a tribal chief.
I'm playing.
I know exactly, yeah. And so, I would like to get your commentary on the reaction to that, because, you know, as an American, I'm like, oh, wow, there's Black people in elected office, which is still rare here unless you're looking at the Outre-mer. So what do you, in a contemporary context and as in a mobility context of taking up space, what do you think this moment means at a time when in the US, Black American political power is being dismantled?
That's a question for me?
Yes.
But this is Tamara's time. I'm not going to take her place. I'm going to welcome Tamara, even as an African American, and not feel offended and feeling like she's taking all the place in my homeland, right? Oh my God, we can have this conversation after the...
It was just a kind of joke, but now for the past couple of days in South Africa, So black people, African people, are getting aggressive towards other black people coming from other African countries. It's not new.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So it's too long of a conversation. If you get me started on Bali Bagayoko and what happened after he was elected, it's just a sheer contradiction of the upheld ideals of colorblindness. It could have been a man winning by a landslide in one of the major cities of the Paris area. And it was turned into the election of the first black mayor in, Saint-Denis, right? But black people are not supposed to exist. So what are we talking about? Yeah, they said, he said, he never did. They said, he said that the city of Saint-Denis is the city of black people. When he said the city of Saint-Denis is the city of kings, because it was an ancient, like a lot of dead kings are buried. So the city of Saint-Denis has been lost to France because this ancient, kingly city is now at the head of the diversity with a capital D, right? So they said that he said that the city of Saint-Denis is the city of black people, when he had said the city of Saint-Denis is the city of kings and the living people. And his words were transformed. They couldn't get over the fact that he was a black man. So from the very moment of his election, we, jumped into racial matters, right? It took this black body pronouncing the words that were totally transformed and construed to enter this conversation around race in a country that does not acknowledge race. So welcome to France, and all those paradoxes. So that's all I can say, otherwise it will go on, and again, this is Tamara's time. Sorry.
Well, if I could just chime in with an observation, I was here in 2024 on a faculty visitorship, and one of the highlights of that time was the conversation that you had with Rokia Diallo, and it just struck me both as this incredible taking up of space to talk in French about Black France, and to be in this space that from the outside seems like it's in service to a celebration of Americans in France. And so I think there is really interesting conversation happening here, thanks to you, that allows for those kinds of conversations to take space.
I think it's the equation, thank you so much, with those words or conversations coming from black bodies. Right beyond the discourse and the public conversation, it's also like what needs to be taken into account is from what bodies are those statements made, because it does matter. Things that cannot be tolerated, understood, accepted are all the more unacceptable if they come from the wrong type of body. And bodies that we don't see because we don't racialize, and we just don't do those things. Like, we only see the bodies of color, and we don't see the bodies that are supposed to be of no color, right? When we're talking about processes of racialization where every category has been made, right? The categories of color, as they are called, and the categories that pass for normal, neutral, and that have been constructed as white. Right? We don't see whiteness. We only see non-whiteness. But you're triggering me right now. Let me stop. Jake.
Thank you again. Fantastic conversation. But there was a book that I've been thinking about throughout your entire conversation. I wasn't going to bring it up because it seemed like it was going off on a tangent, but one or both of you brought it up. Banjo by Claude McKay. So it's the 1920s. It's not Paris. It's Marseille. It's not about African Americans, it's about the whole diaspora. Yes. So many of the debates and arguments in that book are ones we're having 100 years later. It's not about privileged black people. They're people from all backgrounds, most of them défavorisés, as they would say here. And again, it's not Paris, it's Marseille, and the book is soaked in the atmosphere of Marseille. Anyway, so I wasn't going to bring it up, but I keep thinking about it all throughout this night, because you see sort of the elusiveness of coalition building across diaspora lines, as well as so many of the other questions that have been bounced around tonight. So I just wondered, without going off on a tangent,
let me
if you
bother
could
you a
say a
little,
word
Jake.
about banjo. Yeah.
Does it matter that the author of Banjo is Jamaican?
I think it probably does. I think it probably does. But that just adds to the complexity of the book and this conversation.
Yes. No, thank you. Thank you.
As a counterpoint maybe to thinking about artists and scholars who are African Americans who come to France, and the reaction of French people to them and their reaction to French people, it's worth at least thinking about African American soldiers who were in France in World War I and the ones who stayed after, and African American soldiers who were here in World War II, and how they fit in or did not fit in, and what impressions French people had, which weren't of artists or dancers or musicians, but of other people really less privileged, if you will. And you might add to that, of course, the colonial soldiers who also would have been seen in France. As just a counterpoint, I realize we're focused on artists and writers, but there are other African Americans and African people, as you've been pointing out, in Paris or in France in general, and it's a very different story.
Yeah, and that's a really deeply researched area of African American and European and military history that I end up taking up in Beyond the Shores by talking about the post-war period in Germany through the lens not of a black military man, but the wife of a military officer who is stationed, Mabel Grammer, who is stationed in Germany with her husband after the war, and whose life is defined by these various institutions, the military, marriage, and then motherhood. And so it's an interesting layer, right? That was one of the things I was thinking about in my book, to expand the category of people that come to mind when we talk about African Americans abroad, and think about the ways in which class and status and the reasons for which someone is in this place, and who they're representing, right, and who they're not representing, shape their experiences. So.
Thank you for the conversation. I am thinking at the moment through the film of James Baldwin, A Stranger in the Village, in the Swiss Alps. And I'm thinking through it through class and race, because the film was made by a Swiss filmmaker on the essay of James Baldwin. And it's interesting because in the images, James Baldwin although he says he's American and that he's an artist, people don't really believe him. And what they project onto him is Africanness and all the ideas that they have about African people, which are basically poor and asking for money from Swiss people. And I wanted to bring another reference called O Sun, the film by Matt Hondo. I don't know, it's the 70s, but basically the film is talking about the conditions in which thinkers from the African countries were facing here, I think in Paris, actually, the film is taking place. Thinkers, but also artists, like Matt Hondo. I've watched it recently, and I find it, fascinating.
Thank you.
It's not really a question. It's just a statement to say, certainly for visual artists, why do they come to Paris? Because that's where the art is. You have, for visual artists now, there's all different kinds of artists, but you think of the history, of the Grand Tour. White American artists are coming to Europe. They're seeing all the collections. This is what you do. You go to Paris. The collections are not in Marseille, per se. I'm not saying anything against that. I'm just saying, why Paris? Yeah, because this is where the stuff is. This is where the Louvre is, right? So they're going to Rome, and Monia Lewis goes to Rome. Why? Because it's Rome. This is where they're working. So there's a reason why they're going to all these sites where the visual arts, at least, are important because they want to be a part of that dialogue. Now, for writers and others and musicians, it's a little bit different, obviously, but I just wanted to say it's not really a mystery. That's where people went when they wanted to get the training, when they wanted to see all the grand works. This is where they would go, Madrid, etc.
And you were making the point shortly before we started about how this was a place where they could draw from models, right? That African American male artists couldn't draw from white women models at Columbia. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but I thought that was really interesting in terms of making the case for what kind of training and formation and development was possible here.
Yeah, I mean, even women couldn't draw from, black women couldn't really draw from, women in general couldn't draw from the nude for many years. And even Bearden comes in the 50s and is studying the grand works. So there's all sorts of reasons why you would come as a visual artist specifically to Paris to be able to do that. But yes, the idea that a model was nude and you can just paint and draw that person for black people of all kinds was a revelation, or it was something they aspired to because they wanted to know about that. You know, they wanted to know the anatomy and such.
So we'll see where people go after restitutions of all the stolen goods from around the world. But thank you so much, Kelly. I think that was the last question or comment. So let me thank again Tamara Walker for this wonderful presentation and ongoing work